Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we're going to be watching First Crusade, Rise of Alexios Komnenos by Kings and Generals. So, in the last reaction in this series, we saw Byzantine struggles against the Seljuk Turks, as well as sort of struggles within the Byzantine Empire, you know, fighting amongst different leaders that seriously weakened the power of the empire. So this video, I do recognize the name Alexios Komnenos. I think he's a pretty well-regarded emperor, or at least a prominent emperor. Aside from that, I don't really know anything about him, so I'm excited to get into this one and learn about him. If you guys enjoyed this video, please check out the Patreon. I really appreciate that support. And with that out of the way, let's get into this reaction.
The Eastern Roman Empire bet everything on the skilled commander Romanos, but his defeat and capture at the Battle of Manzikert signaled the start of a new crisis. That same year, the last stronghold in southern Italy fell to the Normans, led by...
Yeah, we saw Romanos, who was actually pretty talented, be captured by the Turks, and then, you know, I would say tactfully released back to the Byzantine Empire, where sort of battle ensued with him and the new rulers, and he was defeated. Basically, you know, causing a lot of internal strife within the empire and further weakening it.
By Robert Guiscard, leaving the Byzantines surrounded by enemies. But there was one man determined to preserve the empire no matter the cost. Alexios Komnenos. This is the story of the events preceding the First Crusade, which are often ignored. Welcome to our video on the Battle of Calabria. These medieval armies needed serious steel gear to survive, and in Japan the techniques learned can still be seen today in the Japanese steel kitchen knives produced by our sponsor Kamikoto. Wow,
very fancy. Alright, so check out their video, it's linked down below. Go show them some love and go check out their sponsor. Go show the original creators some support.
The exclusive heavy range are confident, believable Michelin-star restaurant.
Wow, very fancy. Go check out their sponsor. You can get some cool knives.
Following the humiliating defeat at the hands of Alp-Arslan, the Eastern Roman Empire was given generous terms and could still field a massive army, which was well trained and equipped. However, the court in Constantinople rejected the terms and waged a short but costly civil war against Romanos. His stepson, Michael VII, now sat on the throne, but behind the scene, various noble families were competing for power and titles as the state crumbled. The young emperor would eventually earn the nickname Paripinekis, or minus a quarter, for the debasement of the currency, solidus, which now contained only 58% gold.
We talked about this last time, but debasement of currency is basically when, you know, you have, you know, let's say your currency is a gold coin. If you debase your currency, it means you lower the percentage of gold that your coin is made up of. So originally your coin will be 100% gold. Well, maybe now it's only made up of 90% gold. 10% less gold than it was before. It's basically inflation, obviously something that we still deal with today. And they also mentioned sort of the court politics at play. You know, this was a long-standing trend of Eastern Roman politics, particularly because there was no official succession. When the emperor died, it was often a free-for-all. Or even if there was, you know, a chosen successor, it often would not work out smoothly. And so there was a lot of, you know, politicking going on. There was a lot of drama behind the scenes, you know, a lot of tension at court as different power bases, families, and factions sort of jostled to get whoever they supported put into power, or gain influence with whomever was in power at the moment. So that often would destabilize the empire, as you can imagine. It's not necessarily great to have, you know, these different factions constantly moving in and out of power, and, you know, your rulers being overthrown, and this would be a long-standing issue of the empire.
With the remainder being made up of silver and copper. This meant that the buying power of the currency dropped, which in turn crippled the economy, and when Michael raised taxes, there was an immediate response from the Balkans. In general, the sources claim that the 21-year-old emperor was a mere puppet, ruled by different courtiers at different periods, and was only interested in hunting and feasts. Bulgarian rebels, supported by Serbia, raised a pretender, Constantine Bodin, in 1072, who took Skopje and defeated the strategos of the Bulgarian theme. Nish and Ohrid quickly fell before the empire could organize a response. The rebels were crushed at Castoria, but it would take time until 1073 until the remnants were dealt with. Not only did this cost the empire crucial time, but it meant that they couldn't launch a full-scale counterattack to the east, as a large portion of its professional army, or Takhmeta, was busy in the Balkans.
Yeah, so this is another trend that we talked about last episode, was how the Byzantine Empire struggled to keep its affairs in order, and how that would sort of affect the overall strength of the empire. You know, when the Byzantines would be dealing with something in the east, you know, either if we go to the past, the Persians, or the Arabs, or the Turks, whichever enemy they were dealing with on their eastern border, then they would be unable to deal with enemies in the west, or internal enemies, as we can see here. At this point, you know, the Serbs are a prominent force within the empire. The Bulgars have been a problem for the Byzantines for hundreds of years at this point. And vice versa was true as well. If they were dealing with enemies in the west, or internal enemies, then they would be vulnerable to enemies from the east. And, I mean, as you can see, the Eastern Roman Empire is much smaller than it once was, but it's still a big empire at this point, and it still covers a large landmass with a lot of different groups. And so there's a lot of different, you know, issues to deal with, fires to put out, and as you can imagine, that, you know, sort of stretches the empire's forces and its funds thin pretty often, making it vulnerable to different attacks.
The compromise was to send a smaller force, under the command of Alexios Komnenos, along with his younger brother, Alexios, leading a tenth of what Romanos gathered 2 years earlier.
Well, here he is.
Them was a cavalry force of 400 Frankish mercenaries, headed by the Norman Roussel de Bayeux, who was present at Manzikert. By this point, the Seljuks had already broken the eastern defenses and roamed the Anatolian plateau unopposed, but the coastline was secure, as well as any city with stone walls, so the region was far from being lost, and this expeditionary force was crucial in asserting dominance over the nomads.
Yeah, this was, and you know, like I mentioned last time, I'm not like too familiar with Byzantine history, particularly later Byzantine history, but definitely a trend I've noticed is that sort of rural Anatolia is often under attack by nomadic enemies of the empire. The countryside is often being looted and destroyed, whereas the coastal regions and any walled cities are a lot more secure because, I mean, think about it, if you're facing nomadic enemies, like horsemen, as they often were, whether Persian, Arab, or Turkish, then, you know, they're good at raiding large swaths of land, but they're not good at sieging a walled city. If you just have a cavalry force, you can't lay siege to a city that effectively. But rural Anatolia seems to have been pretty constantly under threat for a very long stretch of time, hundreds and hundreds of years within the empire of the Byzantine, within the history of the Byzantine Empire.
The imperial army assembled in the area of Caesarea, where a serious incident drove a wedge between the Byzantines and their mercenaries. After Isaac punished a Frankish soldier, the insulted Norman leader took his men and fled during the night. Upon hearing this news, the Byzantine commander considered sending Alexios to track them down, but that was when he was informed that a Seljuk force was approaching their position. The two armies met near Cappadocia, and after a failed ambush, Isaac was wounded and captured, while Alexios barely escaped. Some of the fleeing soldiers were rejected from the nearby cities, who were afraid the Seljuks were close behind. Meanwhile, Roussel managed to defeat a different group of nomads and seize the town of Ankara, where he proclaimed himself a prince and founded his own state. The news shocked the emperor, who responded by sending his uncle, John Ducas, with a considerable force to deal with the adventurer.
I've never even heard of this before, but a Frankish-led empire established right in the middle of Anatolia. That would have been, frankly, unimaginable a couple hundred years earlier. I mean, a couple hundred years earlier, I'm talking 500s, 600s, 700s. I don't think the Byzantines would have even used Frankish mercenaries at all. But something of, you know, this extent of Frankish... I mean, it's not like a real state. It's just, you know, sort of a power base. But even so, to have this established right in the middle of your empire, that, I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Of the 12,000-strong army, many were fresh recruits, with some veterans from Manzikert, as well as 1,500 Varangians and 500 Franks. Once Roussel learned that the army crossed the Bosphorus, he gathered his own 3,000 men, most of whom were knights. The two armies met on the 10th of May 1074 on the bridge of the Sangarios River, not far from Amorium, which was the Norman power base. The Romans offered amnesty to the adventurer, but their offer was rejected. That is when, rather than waiting for reinforcements from the nearby cities, the inexperienced John Ducas ordered his men to charge across the river. The Byzantines were now in a very precarious position, with the river at their back and the Norman army in front. The three divisions were arranged in two lines, with the right flank led by the Franks, while John held the center with his Varangians. His son, Andronikos, was on the left, with the governor of the Anatolic theme, Nikephoros Photaniates, in charge of the rearguard, composed of the levies. In the early hours of the next day, Roussel rode towards the Frankish line and addressed the men, urging them to defect, which they did. Together, the two groups pushed against the Roman center. As the battle raged on between the most elite troops on the field, Nikephoros Photaniates panicked and ordered a retreat, taking half the army to his estates.
Ooh.
Seeing this, many began to surrender or retreat, and before long the battle was over. John Ducas was captured, alongside his son Andronikos.
Well, again, not only has this Frankish guy set up a kingdom within your empire, now he has defeated the army you sent to conquer him. From a Byzantine perspective, this is looking seriously bad at this point. You know, very, frankly, threatening to the existence of your empire.
Who now contemplated the irony as 3 years ago he was in charge of the rearguard and abandoned Romanos at Manzikert. A new army was quickly gathered under the command of his other son, Constantine. But shortly after crossing to release his family, he died, and another expedition disintegrated, leading to nothing but debt. Roussel decided to make another gamble by proclaiming the captured John Ducas as the new emperor. This was the pivotal moment when desperation forced the Roman hand to choose the lesser evil. After losing his bid for the Seljuk throne against Alparslan, Suleiman and his three brothers fled to the Taurus Mountains back in 1064, and he became the sole survivor after multiple punitive raids. Now that Melikshah I ruled the Seljuk Empire, which was weakening, Suleiman managed to establish himself in the region, which had the exact same climate conditions as the steppe, but was detached from the authority of Isfahan.
I mean, just look at this map. You have several different enemy empires, or enemy states, or enemy power bases established in the middle of Anatolia, you know, in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. You know, this just the image alone really does not bode well for the Eastern Roman Empire. You know, it really shows how vulnerable they are at this point, although they've been vulnerable for, you know, a while at this point.
The nomads raided, but also traded with the local Byzantines, who were themselves cut off from Constantinople. when suddenly Suleiman received an offer which would not only make him an ally of the empire, but also formalize his territorial claims and fill his pockets. All he had to do was deal with Roussel, who just sacked Chrysopolis near Constantinople. The Norman finally met his match as he fell for the classic feigned retreat and was captured by the Seljuks. But before Constantinople could send their ransom, his wife showed up with a generous amount of gold, and the Seljuks released him.
And from this whole situation, we're also seeing how sort of dynastic politics of the different states interplay. This was sort of another common theme, was that in their most desperate moments, struggling Eastern Roman emperors would often turn to their enemies as a way to secure their position, whether it was getting support from the Persians, from, as we see here, the Turks, from the Bulgars. They would secure backing from their enemies in order to keep their throne. And you know, we're seeing that sort of situation here, and perhaps it may be backfiring here because we have another force at play, this you know, Frankish force, but we can see how these complicated dynastic politics sort of you know, interlap and sort of the interplay they have with each other over these different empires.
Desperation really kicked in, and Michael used his connection to Georgia via his wife Maria to convince Tsar George II to hold the eastern frontier and capture Roussel in return for Theodosiopolis, Tau, and Kars. The crucial cities and forts were handed over, but the Georgian army failed, with many joining the Norman cause.
Yikes.
All seemed lost, but the Byzantines were well aware that if this was not handled quickly, rebellions would erupt elsewhere, proclaiming John as their rightful leader. The next candidate to step up to the job was Alexios Komnenos, a 20-year-old energetic and charismatic man who was appointed commander-in-chief and sent to deal with Roussel without any significant funds or army.
I mean, you know, we can see the Eastern Roman Empire is at one of its most vulnerable points right now. You know, it is, you know, Michael is desperate. You know, his position is under serious threat. He's turned to multiple different places to try and get help. None have succeeded. This is a pretty desperate point. And now we're sending Alexios Komnenos without much backing just to, well, see what he can do. Can he fix it? Probably not, but give him a chance.
Unrelenting, the young man used his cunning and appealed to the Seljuks, promising them riches if they would capture the prince. The nomads agreed, and once again accomplished their task by inviting the wanted man to a feast and betraying him. Roussel was brought to the city of Amasya, but the problem was that Alexios didn't have the funds he promised, so he turned to the local populace. Surprisingly, the locals preferred the Norman garrison and grew fond of their prince, who, unlike the empire, protected them from Turkic raids. In order to convince them, Alexios blindfolded Roussel and announced that he was blinded and was in no condition to defend them anymore. This plan worked, and after gathering the funds and paying the Seljuks, Alexios returned to Constantinople victorious and locked him in a dungeon in 1076.
Well, how about that? I mean, clearly the empire still has serious problems. You know, Suleiman is still right there in Anatolia, but Alexios has managed to use his brains to resolve the situation with Roussel. He didn't have much else to use, frankly, so he had to use his cunning. And, you know, he was successful, so there you go. And it also touched on another interesting point in there, which is that the locals would rather put their trust in Roussel than the emperor, the Byzantine court, because he was, you know, better at protecting them from Turkish raids. And to be honest, you know, you can see where they're coming from. Like I mentioned earlier, this region of Anatolia, rural Anatolia, had been subject to raids from nomadic enemies for hundreds of years, and the empire had always done a pretty bad job at protecting it. So the people there, you know, you can kind of understand that they would turn anywhere that they felt would give them sort of a degree of protection. So, I mean, it's actually not that surprising. It makes sense.
This is a good point to shift to the other side of our narrative, as in 1076, the growing tensions between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV erupted into what is now known as the Investiture Controversy. The boundaries between the imperial and papal authority were always blurred, but Gregory was an overly ambitious and influential pope who reformed the church, enforcing celibacy for the clergy, and preached the idea of an organized papal army led by the pontiff. On one occasion,
now, you know, to our modern ears, an organized papal army led by the pontiff, well, that's strange. That's kind of a strange thing for a religious leader to have. You know, a spiritual leader having his own army? Well, yes, the situation was very different 1,000 years ago. In, you know, the Europe of the 11th century, you know, the Pope is not just a spiritual leader. He's not just the leader of the Christian church. He is one of the most important political figures throughout Europe, both in his relationship to the Holy Roman Emperor, you know, because the whole idea is that the Pope invests the Emperor with his position, but also, as you can see, the Pope is trying to expand his secular political control, you know, like a normal king or a normal emperor. So, you know, the Pope really has a lot of secular power alongside his religious authority, which he obviously still holds.
Occasion he wanted to lead an expedition into Al-Andalus, on another to aid the Eastern Roman Empire in retaking their lost lands, provided they accept the primacy of the Catholic Church, before that force retook the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. While these ideas sound familiar now, back then it was unheard of for a pope to wield that much power or even lead his own army. Already the seed of future events was planted in a combination of the desperate Byzantine leadership asking for aid from the West and the desire for increased power for the papacy. Agents were sent throughout Europe, exaggerating reports of violent barbarians defiling and harassing innocent pilgrims, despite the fact that since the Islamic conquest of the Holy Lands, thousands of pilgrims made their way to Jerusalem. Initially, the preferred route was to go to a maritime city, chiefly Venice, and then sail for 2 weeks. But over time, the difficult naval trip was made worse by Arab pirates and became less used than the land route. One could travel to Constantinople by land or sea, then take the Roman roads, enjoying the hospitality in this medieval version of tourism, which the Normans, Seljuks, and general instability made worse. But the stars were not yet aligned for one of the most pivotal changes in history to occur. It would take a different pope and different Eastern Roman emperor for these ideas to coalesce.
That's interesting. So, I mean, we're finally getting to sort of the Crusade element of this. You know, we've mostly been talking about the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, which obviously is very much tied up in the First Crusade, but we haven't covered the Church or the rest of Europe that much. And you know, it's interesting that these ideas were already prevalent before the Crusade actually happened. I was unaware that, you know, this was sort of an idea that Gregory VII had put forward. Yet, you know, it wasn't the right time. You know, we're gonna have to wait a few more years. But yeah, it is interesting that that idea was already circulating. Though, I mean, it makes sense when, you know, we've been talking about how much of a desperate position Michael was in and how vulnerable the Byzantine Empire was, and so you can see why they would basically turn to anyone. I mean, and they have been turning to anyone, and so you can see why they would turn to their Western allies, because they really are just trying to save their empire from total destruction.
Back in Byzantium, the idea of handing out money to solve all of their problems was expanded upon, with the alliance with Hungary and the Normans. In fact, Robert Guiscard was paid a large amount of gold and given 40 titles to bestow upon his followers, each acting as an annual salary. But above all, his daughter was betrothed to the son of the emperor. The idea behind this expensive endeavor was to ensure nominal control over southern Italy, as well as buy time for the state to recover. All of this money had to come from somewhere, so a reform was passed aiming to centralize the grain trade. Until this moment, farmers sold their produce to merchants, who then sold the grain to the populace at a competitive price. But in these troubled times, tax evasion was widespread. The solution was to concentrate the entire grain trade to one city, Redestos, where the price would be the same and each transaction much easier to tax. The immediate aftermath of this policy saw farmers withholding their grain in order to create a shortage, which would then raise the prices. The overcrowded city of Constantinople, filled with refugees from all the lands in Anatolia now given to the Seljuk allies, began to starve, which led to an uprising. Emperor Michael managed to quell it, but the problems were just starting, as this rebellion led to civil war.
Another civil war. The Byzantine Empire, in a form we've seen it in before. It's just a lot of infighting. And they mentioned how, the Eastern Romans had sort of decided that, handing out money was the best way to solve their issues. This is another common theme throughout the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, is that, oftentimes it's just easier to just give out cash rather than to, try and raise a force. So they wanted to maintain nominal control over southern Italy. Really throwing around their wealth is the only way they're going to do that. They've lost complete, political and military control over the Italian peninsula at this point. And they're in no position to raise an army and go take it back. Not politically, not militarily. So the best they can do is just hand out money to, sort of maintain this idea that they are still in control. And they would do this, the Byzantines would do this with a lot of their enemies and their nominal allies, which was maintained through a lot of money given out, some would say a sort of tribute, rather than, the Byzantines being in constant warfare with every power around them. As you can see, they were already in constant warfare. They couldn't afford to get themselves into more military conflicts. And as we're about to see right here, they were also seemingly really frequently dealing with civil war. This is another element of the Byzantine Empire, just really frequent infighting, civil war, dynastic struggles, popular uprisings. Particularly, Constantinople was so important, and when so much of your power is concentrated in one place, it gives the populace a lot of power. If they want to rise up, they can really, they can really change things, because they can really affect the court, because all those important figures are stationed right there in the capital, and that's where all of their power and legitimacy is.
Usually, civil wars involved two sides. However, in this scenario, there were 4 separate rebellions, each with its own goal.
Jeez.
First, there was Philaretos Frachamios, who carved out a very large piece of the empire, centered around Antioch after the Battle of Manzikert. He proclaimed himself emperor and slowly expanded his realm by attacking other Roman cities. Secondly, a federation of cities on the Danube River broke off and sided with the nomadic Pechenegs. In November 1077, the most powerful man in the Balkans, governor of the Dyrrhachiot theme, Nikephoros Vrienios, also proclaimed himself emperor and gathered a coalition of supporters filled with veteran soldiers, as he himself was a capable commander.
Sorry for pausing so much, but you can just see how little control the Byzantine imperial court had over their empire. There's constant uprisings, rebellions, generals going independent, new states being established within Byzantine territory. You think about like a modern nation state, sort of the control of their territory that's wielded, the monopoly over coercion and violence, and compare it to the Eastern Roman Empire at this point. The emperor, the imperial court has so little power over their own territory. They're just so vulnerable.
Lastly, we have Nikephoros Vataniates, the 76-year-old governor of the Antolikon theme, with very few supporters or credentials, who rebelled in October 1078.
Everyone's rebelling.
Vrenios took action, and after taking over much of the western territories, marched on Constantinople, hoping the people would embrace him, but after he was rejected, he raided the suburbs. Pecheneг riders also rode south, hoping to plunder some villages, forcing the pretender to pull back. In the meantime, Vataniates was well aware that he could not take the city on his own, so he pushed the next domino in our story by hiring Seljuk mercenaries. After he took Nicaea, he stationed many of them as garrison forces in western Anatolia, including key cities like Pergamon, Ephesus, and Sardis, cities these steppe raiders could hardly take on their own.
Yeah, this seems like a very risky move.
With the assumption that the moment he asked for them to leave, they would follow his command.
Oh, come on, man.
Back in Constantinople, the aristocracy knew they had to pick a side, so they chose not based on merit, but on how easy it would be to control the next ruler.
I mean, we can already see sort of what's happening, but I like the artistic choice of, if you look at the video, the territory of the Seljuk Empire is, Suleiman's Empire is slowly expanding westwards, because, of course, when you install a Seljuk Turks in a bunch of cities, you can sort of see what's going to happen. So I like that they have the empire sort of slowly expanding westwards, like, yeah, you can see what's going to happen, everybody.
The city rebelled, forcing Michael to abdicate, and Vataniates was invited to take the throne, which he did as Nikephoros III. The new emperor made a deal with the wife of Michael, Maria. She married him in exchange for the recognition of her child, Constantine Ducas, as the heir to the throne. Nikephoros III then proceeded to hand out the customary gifts and titles, but doubled down by forgiving all debt and expanding various rights to secure the rule of his new dynasty. One of those titles was that of Caesar, or second in command, which was offered to Vrenios, but was rejected. Phrahamios, on the other hand, agreed to accept him as emperor in return for control over his territory, stretching between the key cities of Antioch, Melitene, and Edessa.
Of course, Caesar comes from Julius Caesar. And yes, we are still using that term at this point in 1078, more than 1,000 years after Caesar. And it's second in command because, Augustus was truly the first empire. So Augustus would be number 1, and Caesar would be number 2. That's sort of the ranking. Although throughout Roman history and Eastern Roman history, different titles would be used for the emperor. We just call them the emperor in English, but there was many different titles used. But Caesar for a long time had been used as sort of this junior imperial position, second in command.
However, the rebellions didn't die out, and Vrenios was able to take over most of the Balkans, forcing Nikephoros III to appoint Alexios to crush him. It was 1078, and Alexios marched west with an army between 5,000 and 10,000 troops strong, 2,000 of which were Seljuk cavalry, 2,000 Komiteni, or...
Okay, first off, just about the numbers of men we're talking about, you might be thinking 5 to 10,000 men. Sure, that's a lot of men. That's thousands of men. It's not too many, to be honest, and you'd be right. Think about both armies back in the time of Caesar and then the size of armies to come, say in the 17 and 1800s, you know, both in antiquity and in modern times, armies would balloon up to tens and then hundreds of thousands of men. At this point, we are mostly talking of forces of, you know, thousands of men, perhaps in the low tens of thousands, if we're talking about a lot of men. Although, I mean, when we actually get to the First Crusade, it's my understanding that there were a lot of men involved in that. And then also, you know, when I think of sort of the Turkish influence on the Byzantine Empire, I'm prone to think of the Ottomans, because they were the ones who would eventually conquer the Byzantines. But, you know, we see the Seljuk influence in Anatolia. I mean, there's a Seljuk Empire in Anatolia, and we see that in all these battles, even in the western parts of the empire, this is in the Balkans, Seljuk Turks are involved. They're involved in all of this. So I'm honestly kind of surprised at the extent to which the Seljuk Turks have influence throughout the empire, even at this point.
Elite infantrymen, a few hundred Frankish knights, and a newly raised regiment of Athanati, or Immortals, with the remainder made up of newly raised levies. The rebel army was not only more numerous, composed of 12,000 seasoned warriors, a mixture of Takhmeta, Slavic, Pecheneg, and Frankish mercenaries, but was also led by a more experienced commander. Alexios made camp on a shore of a small stream near the fortress of Calabria, but he didn't fortify his camp as a sign of strength. He quickly sent out Seljuk scouts, learning the location and size of the enemy force, but some of the scouts got captured, and that exposed his own position. Rhenios knew that he had his opponent outnumbered, so he marched his army for the decisive battle. Alexios was on the defense, and held his left flank with his Immortals. The center was made up of Franks, while the right, under the command of Constantine Katakalon, was made up of the Khometeni and Seljuks. The Turks made up an extreme right wing, ready to counteract the enemy Pechenegs, with another smaller detachment on the far left, positioned within a hollow, concealed from the enemy. Rhenios had deployed his army in 3 divisions, each in 2 lines, with Pecheneg cavalry to his far left. The right wing consisted of a 5,000-strong unit, bolstered by Frankish knights and Thessalian cavalry under his brother John. His left was made up of 4,000 troops from Thrace and Macedonia, while he led the 4,000-strong center. As the rebels approached, the ace Alexios hid was sprung, and the powerful wing under John was caught between the Immortals, led by Alexios, and those lying in ambush, who were now rushing towards the battle with war cries. The rebels panicked, but after cutting down one of his enemies, Rhenios rallied his men, halting their rout and urging them back into the fray. Despite his best efforts, Alexios, who was in the midst of the battle slashing with his sword, saw his men break and flee as they were chased and cut down.
Yeah, I mean, smart strategy from Alexios, and, you know, respect that he is, he's right in there fighting, but he is quite, well, we don't know exactly how many men he had. They said 5,000 to 10,000, but he is probably quite badly outnumbered, so that's, you know, that's quite something to overcome.
Meanwhile, on the right, the Pechenegs managed to evade the Seljuk riders and overwhelmed the right wing. In the center, Nikephoros persuaded the Franks to desert the loyalists, as they swore fealty to him in the middle of the battle. All seemed...
Wow, man, the Franks are, you know, not putting up a good show of loyalty throughout this video.
lost, so Alexios gathered 6 of his companions and charged into the enemy line, hoping to kill the usurper and end the war.
Wow.
It was aided by the sudden decision of the Pecheneg riders to turn back and rush toward the camp of their allies. They took as much loot as they could, while the camp followers ran to the safety of the rearguard. Part of Rhenios' army was celebrating, while others were running, and it was in this atmosphere of utter confusion that Alexios spotted the purple-clothed royal horse with both swords of state to its side. He immediately rushed in, killed some retainers, and rode off with it back to his camp. Once he arrived, he found the remnants of his now shattered army and began lifting their spirits, spreading the rumor that the enemy commander was dead as he rode atop his horse.
I mean, pretty impressive. Despite him being outnumbered and most of his army fleeing, Alexios still kept his head and thought about what was the smart thing to do in that scenario. So, you know, that's respectable.
At that very moment, an extra contingent of Seljuk horse archers made their way to the camp, just in time for the counterattack the loyalists were about to launch on the unsuspecting enemy. The reformed army was once again divided in three, with two detachments lying in ambush, while the third, a mix of Seljuks and Immortals, planned to execute the classic but extremely difficult feigned retreat. Multiple small groups of nomads fired their arrows at the rebels, scattering many of them. Next, the heavy cavalry charged in. One of the riders spotted Phrenios, and according to the Alexiad, dashed at full gallop straight at Phrenius, and thrust his spear with great violence against the latter's breast.
Wow.
Phrenius, for his part, whipped his sword out quickly from its sheath, and before the spear could be driven home, he cut it in two, and struck his adversary on the collarbone, and bringing down the blow with the whole power of his arm, cut away the man's whole arm, breastplate included.
Oh my god. This is some intense melee combat where the most important men on the field are out there fighting for their lives.
After a while, Alexios ordered the retreat, hoping it wouldn't turn into a rout as the veterans gave chase. Again, according to the Alexiad, forthwith at the given signal, those in ambush rode through them like swarms of wasps from various directions, and with their loud war cries and shouts and incessant shooting, not only filled the ears of Phrenius's men with a terrible din, but also utterly obscured their sight by showering arrows upon them from all sides. The bold plan had worked, and before long, the rebel leader was exhausted, and despite his best efforts, the day belonged to Alexios Komnenos.
Wow.
Phrenios was blinded, but pardoned and allowed to return to Adrianople.
A pretty impressive victory from Alexios Komnenos. I suppose this is the start of his rise.
As for the victorious general, he was not allowed back into the capital, and instead was sent out against a new pretender, Nikephoros Vasilakis, who rose up in Thessaloniki, attracting many of the remaining rebels. But one night attack later, this rebellion was also put down. It was now 1080, and the gold content of the Solidus fell to 33%.
Wow.
As the fourth Nikephoros rose up in rebellion. This time it was Melisinos who rebelled with the aid of Suleiman.
That is some really quick debasement of currency. I mean, it might be some of the fastest I've seen. It's only been a few years, and the gold content has decreased rapidly.
By that point, Suleiman received the title of the Sultan of Rum from the Sultan Melik Shah.
Ah, okay. So now he's got some official recognition from the main Seljuk Empire, which seems like it would only make him stronger and put the Byzantines in an even worse position. Plus, I mean, look at the map. Suleiman now controls like almost all of Anatolia, aside from some key Byzantine coastal areas. So, you know, the Eastern Roman Empire is still in deep trouble.
In return for Suleiman's support, Melisinos opened the gates of Nicaea, which fell to the hands of the Sultanate of Rum, once again without a fight. Alexios was ordered to deal with the man who happened to be his brother-in-law, but this time he refused.
Ooh.
No action was taken against him, since news reached the capital that Robert Guiscard was planning to launch a massive invasion, after a monk impersonating Michael VII appealed to him to take back his throne, and Alexios was needed to stop that incursion. And it was right around this time that...
I mean, it just only gets worse for the Byzantines. They're just facing so many different enemies, and new enemies are constantly appearing. And you can also I'm not sure exactly how Alexios Komnenos' journey goes. I don't know his story. But I feel like you can sort of see his level of power and influence rising. You know, he has refused an order from the Emperor, but hasn't been punished because he's so important to the Empire. You know, that is someone very powerful, and that's a threat to the Emperor. You know, if Alexios is at that level of power, that's frankly a threat to the current imperial court. But they clearly need him in order to survive, so they don't have much of a choice.
The old and childless Nikephoros III decided to break the agreement he made with Maria and appointed one of his relatives the heir, alienating the Komneni family, which joined the rebels. In April 1081, a band of German mercenaries was bribed and opened the gates of Constantinople to Alexios and his army, which proceeded to brutally sack the city. The Varangian Guard continued to defend the palace, but 3 days later, the Patriarch convinced the now 79-year-old emperor to abdicate. Alexios I Komnenos became the emperor.
Well, there he is. It happened faster than I even would have guessed. We have Alexios Komnenos now in power.
While we now tend to think of Alexios as a capable ruler, at the time of his coronation, the Sultanate of Rum was handed most of Anatolia and supported another pretender to the throne, a usurper. The Normans were about to invade. Control over Serbia and Bulgaria was nominal. The alliance of the Danubian cities was in rebellion, supported by the Pechenegs. The treasury was empty, the manpower was depleted, and the solidus fell to 10% gold content.
Wow.
No man alive could unify the bickering families and hold the empire together, while also campaigning against this many enemies. But Alexios' mother, Anna Dalasini, was no man. Alexios' mother not only played a pivotal role in his rebellion, but was the real power behind the administration for the next 15 years, second only to her son. She arranged marriage alliances and delicately balanced the power between the most powerful people in the empire.
Yeah, so, I mean, that moment, like, no man could control this, but she was no man. Sort of a Lord of the Rings moment. But we talked about in the last video how in a system like this, women could wield a lot of power in a court system. Now, they often needed to wield that power through a man. Sometimes not. Sometimes a woman could be the face of power, but oftentimes they needed to have a man in the position of emperor or in some position of power. But women could wield a lot of influence behind the scenes with the sort of court politics, the dynastic politics. So as we can see here, there were a lot of really influential women throughout Eastern Roman history, just because of sort of the system that they operated under. Oops.
The previous approach of purging political opponents was abandoned and replaced with mercy and amnesty. Many old titles were discarded, and instead new ones were created. Nikephoros Melisinos was pardoned and made Caesar, as well as the governor of Thessaloniki. The extended Komnenos family was given important posts. Precious gifts were sent to the Pope, Doge, Holy Roman Emperor, and various Italian lords, while Alexios mustered an army to meet Robert Guiscard.
So we're seeing that Byzantine strategy of, they will use military force when necessary, like with Guiscard here, but in any situation where they can use money or titles or gifts to placate a threat, they'll do that instead, because they just cannot afford to fight all these enemies that are emerging. They have to use the resources they have to deal with them, and we're seeing Alexios do that here.
You can check out the 2 videos we made covering the conflict, including the Battle of Dyrrhachium, which was as devastating as Manzikert, via the link in the description and in the top right corner. Despite numerous setbacks, Alexios and his coalition held out long enough until Guiscard died of malaria in 1085. But in order to repay the Venetian allies who made this victory possible, Alexios made considerable concessions to the Republic. The Doge was granted the new hereditary title of Protosevastos, making him the fourth in imperial seniority.
Wow.
The Venetians were granted gold, honors, and several churches in the empire. Shops, houses, and 3 landing stages were granted on the Golden Horn, and all Venetian traders were exempt from customs duties and sea taxes. In return, Venice was to answer when called upon and defend the Adriatic border. This caused a drastic shift and would spiral out of control as Western trade colonies drove the local merchants out of a job. In our next episode, we'll continue building up to the First Crusade, and we'll show how the Eastern Roman Empire's situation became direr and explain what was going on with the Seljuks. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
Alright, well, please check out the original video, of course, and leave a like and subscribe to Kings and Generals. Yeah, really fascinating video on Eastern Roman history. We still haven't really gotten to the Crusade yet, but we're sort of building up to it, as you can see. You know, we're sort of witnessing... I mean, frankly, I think it's remarkable that the Byzantine Empire was able to survive another 400 years after this, because you can basically see how, like, pieces of the empire are just getting given away over time. You know, the empire's land, titles, trade rights, churches, wealth, it all gets parceled out in an attempt to defend whatever empire is still there. So it's remarkable that it even managed to survive another 400 years. We're also seeing the power of Venice and the power of the Venetian Republic will only continue to increase around this era. Yeah, there's just a lot of fascinating stuff going on, and I might check out those videos they suggested about the battles that Alexios fought against Crusade, I think his name was. But we will continue this series on the First Crusade. It's been really fascinating so far. More about Byzantine history than I expected, but I'm always interested to learn about the Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. I've been particularly interested in them lately. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, all that good stuff. I hope all you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.